Today is John Everett Jones, who is our local scholar on the early Swedes to America, to America, but to the Jamestown area. And he has a website, and he'll tell you about that.
Okay.
He did some research with Don Sandy a couple years ago on the Hessel Valley records. He photographed them, and they have a very creditable scholarly article in one of the genealogy journals of Swedish history. So we're just really delighted to have you here.
So in trying to locate this history of what was going on in the Swedish community when they were first here as settlers from 1847 and 48, when they first started settling in our area, through until the Civil War, as I was saying, there's not much going on in terms of documentation. We have a couple of censuses, we have a few land exchanges, almost no biographies written in the area of that time, very few recollections. It's a gaping absence in the documentation. And so it's hard to see how that community lived. The one source are religious documents. Of those religious documents, they are almost exclusively Lutheran. So we're only getting, the normal bet is if you were going to bet on a Swedish immigrant, the first thing you would say is they're not religious in America, actually. The second thing you would say is they hated the church. So actually the third choice would be the Lutheran. It would be a minority opinion about what was actually happening. But that's all the data that I have available. That's all the information that I have available. So I'll be looking at what is available, what happened here locally, and try and think about how that might suggest how life was here in the community. When you think of Jamestown Swedes, you'll identify it probably with Lutheran Church. Even though the community wasn't necessarily of that, certainly the community of my great-grandfather or my grandfather was not that. So when we think of actually existing, what is Swedish today, we look at the Lutheran Church of that. And there's good reasons for that. It is a monument in town. It's really one of the most significant things built by Swedes in our area. It's a beautiful church. And it has a long and very deep tradition. That more or less relates to one person, strangely enough. Before Julius Lincoln was here, before all of that, even really before the church was built, one minister changed the way the whole landscape here in Jamestown, and that was C.O. Hultgren, Carl Hultgren. And so this is a favorite picture usually among the Lutherans, is him enjoying fishing in Chocolate Lake. This is when he's later, which is also a favorite because of his hairstyle. But he's a remarkable person, a remarkable individual, and he's really worthy of a substantial biography that perhaps a good Lutheran will do at some point. But the most significant thing about Hultgren is that he had success as a minister in the area. And I'll get back to that later, but that's a really important, he was able to deal with the flock. He was able to minister to the flock. It was in Jamestown, it was in Sugar Grove. And that's evidently turns out to be a big deal. Why did he have success? Much of it could be that he just worked hard. In his journals, he writes that he didn't have a horse. And he's covering a territory from Brockton all the way down to Youngsville, from Columbus, near Quarry, all the way over to Randolph. He borrows rides, does whatever, but mostly he walked farm to farm. And so he was administering to the flock. I'm sure the other ones did, but I don't know that they did worked as hard as he did. He remembers waking up in barns with snow on his face. You know, he put in the effort, and from that effort, he built a congregation and served from 1864 until 1895, a very long tenure in the area. But there's more than just hard work that talks to his success. He came from the very area where almost all the Swedes in our region came from. So he had experienced the same things that they had. He was born in Vena, and then the family emigrated from Målilla, the same as my family. And all of that is near where the original families were from, who settled in Sugar Grove in 1848. There's something more, though, about him than others. When he arrived in America, he was unfortunate enough to be on the ship, the Franklin, arriving in 1853. That ship had 600 people on board. A little bit more than a third of those were Swedes. They had been taken advantage of. They had been lied to by an unscrupulous travel agent in Göteborg, whose name was Johnson, so it's not really tying things down very much. And so they were under-provisioned on the ship. And then unfortunately, that ship ran into storms, it was delayed, it took them forever to get to port in New York City. There was looting and people stealing provisions on board the ship. The account from that period does not have very nice things to say about the Irish and Germans who were aboard. And 15 Swedes ended up dying as a result. Most of those were children. So he had lived an experience as a young man that was really quite moving. And you'll find many of the people got very religious after having dealt with an experience like that coming to America. He was also well prepared in the ministry. He was one of the very first products of the American Swedish seminary that became Augustana College and Augustana Seminary. He started out working for Lars Esbjorn. So he really began in his life working in America for the man who would then be the first professor at the seminary and who is really credited as being the first Swedish, first 19th century Swedish Lutheran minister here in America. So all that is to say that what we know of Jamestown, which is at times very much tied into being Lutheran, it can be traced back to Hultgren, but the time I'm studying is before Hultgren. And it's before the avalanche of Swedes coming in. And it's really a different time period. So it's very hard to get beyond what we know of Jamestown, what I think of Jamestown, and really look with fresh eyes at what was going on. So what was the time period like before the Civil War? What was it like here, religiously speaking? These are the primary sources that we have to look at. Eric Norealis visited Jamestown several times. He was a Lutheran minister who settled in Vasa, Minnesota. Many of the congregants from our area moved to be in his parish there. Not because of him, but it was a coincidence that they both moved to the same area. We know we have Julius Lincoln's histories, first in Swedish and then second in English, talking about the history of the Lutheran Church, the first Lutheran Church. We have the meeting minutes, the protocols from the different congregations. We have letters that were written by the congregation to Jonas Svensson. Those are primarily in the ECLA archives outside of Chicago. We have a lone Methodist voice from Helena Stonehouse, which has a little bit of detail, but very few details about what the period was like. And then we have an autobiography of the first minister, first Lutheran minister in the United States, in our area. But unfortunately, the one example that has been able to be found in Sweden is missing the chapters about Jamestown. So, we don't have a lot to go on. The problem with the Lutheran histories is many of them seek to demonstrate how the church became a perfect guiding light for the community. It's self-serving. it's quite understandable, quite reasonable. Even Norielis, who was really quite interested in history and genealogy and is doing remarkable work, his opinions come to bear. And so that you have to look at in seeing that. But the worst example, or perhaps the best example of why it's difficult to find out about this time period, is an attitude among some of the Lutheran historians. So this is a man who was important in our area because he was involved with the centennial in 1946, and his interest was researching Jonas Swenson, who was the second minister in the Lutheran Church. And so he wrote in his Harvard dissertation that the mind of the immigrant of this period, specifically the period that I'm talking about now, simply did not have the capacity to grasp the meaning of the church as an institution of sacramental grace. All right, it's a lot packed in there. It's a Harvard doctoral thesis. My opinion is that Lawson was wrong. He was wrong in understanding the documents of the period, and he was wrong in understanding the people of our area. He didn't understand the congregation and how prepared they were. He had not studied the congregation and what they had gone through their life experiences. And so I think the statement that he made was misguided, and it's full of prejudice. It's a prejudice towards these stupid small-liners, and it's a prejudice against these poor small-liners. Edward Lawson decided that the congregation was to blame for Jonas Swenson's melancholy, his difficult times here in Sugar Grove, and it explains that because the people were stupid and ignorant, that's why Swenson left after only 2 years servicing here to go to Andover. In Andover, he was quite a successful, he had a long tenure in Andover, and Jonas Swenson eventually was a president of the Augustine Synod. So let's look at so I'm going to take a break away from this introduction and look at what the situation was for the Swedes who were actually emigrating at that time. The main reference that everybody goes back to was written by George Stevenson, a professor in 1932. He's a notable professor for doing some of the early histories of immigration, of Swedish immigration. And he wrote a book specifically about religion and how it affected immigration in 1932. The key thing about that is he's still part of a generation that connect directly with some of the people who actually participated in the events. In general, the situation in Sweden, you all probably know better than I, it was a state church. The Lutheranism of the church was dispensed by priests who were shockingly worldly at times and uninterested in our flock. I would also add that the specific parishes that our people are from were the poorer parishes, and they likely carried the poorest priests in their position. So it may be that the situation was even more aggravated than in general in Sweden. The priests also represented the authority of the state, and they reported to government officials. Priests controlled where you moved, how things were going on in your life, and were commonly resented. So during the 1840s, the period when our immigrants were thinking about emigrating, two important movements were actually happening in Sweden. And it's a new religious inspiration was happening in Sweden. The two movements were the Lutheran movement and then also Pietism. I'll bunch in the temperance movement with Pietism and talk about that later. Now the Lutheran were actually people who read the Bible, and that's why they're called the Lutheran. It's literally a translation of the readers. These were people who would often get together and have Bible study in their houses. That was technically illegal in Sweden. And so it was any sermonizing or religious readings outside of the church had to be approved by the church, and if they weren't, it was you were prone to difficulties. As a result of the interest in religion in the 1840s, I would say in this period in Sweden, it's kind of like the 1970s. Just a lot of things were going on religiously, and I think the 1840s in Sweden were similar to that. The problem with the Lutheran movement, these readers, is typically you will hear them about the north of Sweden, but that doesn't have anything to do with ours. Those Lutherans became a sect, the Eric Jansen and the Jansenist sect, and they created their own community in Illinois. Or you would talk about the Mormon missions and the success of those. That's also to some extent related to this interest in religion at that time period. These readers would be part of, but it's not specific to not specific to Jönköping or Kalmar or Östergötland. So what we can say about the people who are in that area, that also, or what Stevenson said about the people who were also in that area, at that time period, there was also a great religious fervor. I started off by saying generally you would be of the opinion that if it were a Swede and they were an immigrant, they probably weren't that interested in religion. After studying more and reading more in the area, and then looking at the lives of the individuals that actually were part of the first community, I think I've changed my mind. I actually believe now that they were much more religious than people had assumed, and much more religious than what the ministers have written in their doctrine. And that is, I think, the basis of the problems that I'll talk about later. The other part of what was going on, beyond the fact that the laity was becoming active and becoming interested in reading, the other thing that was going on was Pietism. So there was a change within the ministry itself, inspired by Germans and the studying of German movement by the students who then became priests, but also, strangely enough, and it'll come back to work our way around, is the presence in Stockholm of a Methodist missionary. He was brought in to service the English church in Stockholm, and George Scott was his name. And he was influential not only in Sweden, but he also tours in the United States. What was noteworthy about Scott is he was talking about the life in Christ and a greater awareness of trying to fulfill Christianity through the way you lived. And that completely is what Pietism is talking about. And you can see from that, that's the tie-in to the temperance movement. Eventually, Scott was pushed out of Stockholm, but the effects of his being and teaching in Stockholm resonated for really the entire 19th century in Sweden. After Scott, during Scott's period, he was a close associate with Rosenius. Rosenius began the Pietist magazine or newspaper, and Rosenius chose not to become an official priest of the state, but became a religious authority, a religious figure within Swedish culture, which was very influential among very hardline Lutherans to very free state-oriented people. Rosenius believed, though, that what he wanted to do was reform the church. He was not a free state. That happens from American influence, probably after the Civil War. On down to the mission, the influences that resulted in the mission church in the United States with Waldenstrom. The Pietist movement, this is Stevenson's remark about the influence of this movement. Specifically that because of the way people were thinking, because of the way they were demonstrating their religion, it was going towards democracy. So he saw it as a route that explained how these people's thinking about religion, how the relationship with religion was also pushing them towards America. The temperance movement is not the same thing as the Pietist movement, but they're so closely associated. And for us in Jamestown, we, at least from my point of view, I don't put as much emphasis on the importance of temperance in the culture here as I should. There was perhaps more of a divide than a divide within the community than not, but there were large influences of temperance. Probably most of the original families who settled in Sugar Grove and in Jamestown were people who did not drink. The original ship that the Virginia, that the first families came over on that arrived here, the captain did not drink. The owner did not drink. So the temperance movement in this time period was a very active movement in Sweden, and I believe that the people who decided to choose our area to settle in were perhaps not teetotalers, but they were in sympathy with the temperance movement. So now I want to change completely, after talking about these high-winded things about religion, about the cast of characters who are in our area. And those I'll explain later on why they became a problem. These people become the problem. The first is the founding family. The reason why there was a community that grew up around Sugar Grove, around Chalmers Valley. These are Karen Jonsdottir and German Jonsson. The Johnsons bought the property. They were the first to buy property in the area of Chalmers Valley. Their daughters were with Faulkner and with Struthers. And it's on their land. The Swedish cemetery was placed, and the first Swedish church was built on their land. I'll get back to it later, but they moved finally from the area, possibly for religious reasons. Another family that were part of the first that arrived in 1848 in the group are Charlotte Sensdottir and John Frederick Johnson. Okay? Or, pardon me, I'm mixing that up. It's Frederick J. Johnson, is the way he's known in our histories. His younger brother is Charles M. Johnson, and he married Carolina Dahl, who was the sister of one of the other first immigrants. Another important leader in the community was A.P. Gelm. A.P. Gelm shows up as being one of the most active in the area, and when Frederick Johnson wrote a history of our area in 1870, he notes that A.P. Gelm, even though Gelm arrived many years later, Gelm was the one that had driven them from Hässelby to Jönköping. So there's an old connection with these people that predates their emigration. Catherine Johansdottir and Peter Peterson, you start looking at names that become very familiar in terms of origin. They're from Lannebecker. And so much of these same people are from the same church, from the same parish, and then they'll be acting in our area in the same way. And then finally in Jamestown, there's a couple that do seem to have an influence, and that's Carl Jonsson, Klang, oftentimes, and his wife Charlotte Dulles, one last group, because I don't know about them. I don't know whether they were religious leaders or not. The only thing that I know is they were the first Swedes to move out of this area to Minnesota. So whether the reasons for that, I'm not certain of. So now we'll change from those people who were leaders in the church to talk about the ministers who were administering to this difficult flock. Almost all of the commentaries start with a reference to the North River Mission, and that is the official name of the Bethel Ship Mission that was in the port of New York City. Not all the Swedes at that time came through the port of New York City, but there's almost no commentary about religion that was happening with Swedes in the United States that doesn't reference that mission with what ensued thereafter. almost always the discussion is of Olaf Gustav Hedström. Hedström is the, O.G. Hedström is the one that is the most dominant force about that. He actually didn't start the ministry. It was started by Peter Bergenlund, who was a reformed sailor, and it was started by the Methodist leaders of New York City. They called in Hedström. Hedström was a normal Methodist minister working up in the Catskills among tanners and lumbermen. And he was brought down to the harbor to administer to incoming Scandinavians. This is testaments old that they handed out at the ship. And they took a physical ship and made it into a church that was anchored about where most of the immigrant ships would arrive in New York City. So that's the Bethel ship. And that's the location. It's not far from Wall Street. Trinity Church is where it is. It was located off pier, between Pier 11 and Pier 10. And as a result of the ministry of Hedström, there developed a whole group that went out from this mission that became the first ministers in Chicago, the first ministers in many of the cities in Illinois, the first ministers in Minnesota. The influence really can't be underestimated. Also, because his brother, Hedström had brought his brother there, the connection between New York City and Henry County, Illinois became established. That portion of Illinois became established because of his brother's influence there. That's why the Jansenists operated there. The whole development of Swedish immigration is greatly influenced by this one man. In 1853, the Methodist Church established in Jamestown a mission to cater to serve the Swedes in our area. And so the first official religious figure in our area was a man named Olaf Hultgren. Now Hultgren was also a reformed sailor, and he was full of vigor, I think is what my brother-in-law would call him. He was here and was evidently very successful, but then he had cholera that he caught at the first conference meeting, and so he lasted 1 year in Jamestown, and then he was gone. He was then replaced further on, but let me get to the other side of the equation, and that would be the Lutherans. Hammond was probably sent up here because this guy arrived in New York. Bent Gustav Bergenlund, had come from Copenhagen. He had been sick the entire time, had been stolen from. He arrived basically nude, nudish, without clothes, without money, without anything, in New York Harbor. Hedström brought him into the mission, nursed him back to health. I think he had deliriums from the seasickness all the way crossing, and found him work. Then after a couple weeks working out on a farm, he came back to the mission and said, no, I really want to, I don't want to do this. I don't want to work on a farm. And so he borrowed money, and they said, well, there's a community in Jamestown, perhaps you can find work there. So, and Hedström, according to Bergenlund, Hedström had given him a recommendation as a teacher. So Bergenlund arrived in our area in about Easter of that year, and I don't think it's a coincidence that almost immediately there was a Methodist mission posting here in Jamestown as well. So I believe reaction to Bergenlund. Bergenlund is the outcast from all of the histories. All of them discuss how he was a bit peculiar, how he created infighting within the community, how he wore gloves sometimes when he was giving sermons. A whole series of negative reports are made by the Lutheran Church and their histories of Bergenlund. So even though he was officially within their ranks from 1853 till 1857, and even though he was eventually ordained by the same synod in 1860, He eventually left America, returned to Sweden, became ordained there, and served until the end of his life in an area called Solberg. He wrote, because so much had been written about him, he wrote his own autobiography. And that's the book that I was alluding to earlier, which we would love to hear what his account was of his time in Jamestown. But there were very few original copies, and the single copy that's in the National Library, it's broken, and we only have the first 16 pages of that. This is what Hasselquist wrote about the congregation. There were 67 people in the area, and they had found somebody to serve the area. And this is Hasselquist writing to the Home Missionary Society to get money to help support their ministry. So initially, Bergenlund was seen favorably, or at least usefully, in his position here in Jamestown. But it's likely the same Hasselquist, who was from the same area of Sweden, he's from the same Hara, the same region of this. He probably is the person who blocked Bergenlund from being fully ordained within the Swedish, what became this Augustana Synod. So I mentioned that Olaf Hamren died of cholera. He was replaced by an interesting figure coming from the mission in New York City. That man's name was Jacob Bredberg. Bredberg was an ordained state minister from Sweden. When he came here, he joined the Methodist faction of New York City, of the mission there, pardon me, not the faction. And there he did work as a translator and also as a minister. He translated texts from Moravian and from German and I think a couple other languages to Swedish to be able to be used in the Methodist hymns. And so he also turns out to be a negative figure for the Lutheran Church because, first of all, he became a Methodist. And then after leaving Jamestown, he went to Chicago. And then he left the Methodist parish there and then became the head of St. Ansgari Church in Chicago, following Unionists. And so, which is, I think, sometimes called the Jenny Lind Chapel of that. It's not the Jenny Lind Chapel in Andover, but it received money from Jenny Lind. So Bredberg was here in Jamestown during much of the conflict that was happening. He was very well educated. And he was a proper Lutheran minister, which meant, in his letter to Norelius, he said, I was never a Lutheran, a true follower of Luther, until I became a Methodist in the United States. Meaning that when he was celebrating his state functions in the church in Sweden, he felt that he had not fully appreciated what Luther had said. This is the character that Lawson had written about, Jonas Svensson. So he's number 2 for the Lutherans. Okay? So now we're on number 2 and number 2 for the Lutherans. Jonas Svensson is educated in Sweden, arrives to be a missionary in a sense to this church. He's very much the right sort of Lutheran priest to come to the United States. I'm going to talk about that later. And so he arrived in Chandler's, first in Jamestown, where he was taken in by Bredberg and had dinner with him, with this former Lutheran minister. And then he went to Sugar Grove, and for 2 years he complained in his diaries. The diaries of him are still there. There's some characterization, perhaps he had some form of depression. He was going from a situation that was quite nice. He was newly married, he was a newlywed, arriving with his wife and his wife's sister, not to an area like this, which he was accustomed to, but to this. And life was hard here, and there wasn't means, and I don't know that that was the compelling feature. I think more of the feature was, not only was it hard here, but the people were very difficult to work with. So even before a year is up, he's writing in his diary that he should be leaving the area. And instead of going to Chicago, which he may have gone, eventually he decides in the second year to go to Andover, and he had a long tenure, as I mentioned earlier, in Andover. He leaves then after 2 years. So there's a vacancy here on the Lutheran side. On the Methodist side, the last part of the equation before the Civil War is a man named S.B. Newman. Newman is a fascinating character. He arrives in 1842. He's a very early Swede arriving. He is likewise not a sailor, but might as well have been. He is a converted man. He is a minister, becomes ordained, not ordained, first becomes minister in Alabama, and then is called up to the church mission in New York City, and then is placed by Hedstrom in Jamestown. He has a long tenure here as well, and he also wrote an autobiography. Last for the Lutherans during this time period is John Patterson, who is from not from the same area as the people who are here, and he only lasts 2 years as well. But after that, in northwestern, I believe it's northwestern Minnesota, he has a long tenure at his future congregation. Okay, so now I want to. Those are the players involved in all this, and let me try and put you through what I see as happening. The very first thing that they established was some sort of community here. And the community at first was organic. I hate using that overused word now. People had brought Bibles, people had brought scholarly works. They administered to themselves without the need for a minister between 1847 until 1853. In 1853, Bergenlund helps to establish the first Lutheran charter here in Jamestown. I don't know that he did anything separate for Sugar Grove or for other congregations. And so in flowery language and irregular notations, this is the first organizing document for congregations in our area. I say that for two reasons. On the first part, for the Methodists, they were organized as a class, so they wouldn't have had a charter in this way. They became part of the existing Methodist structure. And secondly, Methodist records from that area don't exist or have not been found. And so as far as the first religious document, notes from here, the long list here seems to be not signed, not people signing the accord, but rather a tally of people. So it's not necessarily denoting membership. The other thing that the group did, the people did, in Jamestown they just met in other people's churches. So they would ask for space and the Lutherans would use other people's space. The Methodists were within the American Methodist churches, the Yankee churches. But down in Sugar Grove, in Chandler's Valley, they actually built a church. And so this is the picture of the church after the Civil War. And that church is not located where the current Hessel Valley Church is, but rather up where the cemetery is. And so that land, which was given by German and Catherine Johnson, that land where the cemetery is was also the location of the first church. That first church probably looked more like the building on the right. I don't know that the interior was finished the way it was. So let me finish with the complication of trying to talk about these congregations and how they were organized. And try and first deal with the Lutherans. Okay? You had ministers arriving from Sweden who, to some extent, disagreed with the Swedish church. Nearly all of the important first ministers of Augustine Synod, the first leaders, disagreed with the church, were pietists, were in favor of the Lutheran movement and were highly influenced by Methodism. And almost all of them had positive reactions to Hedstrom's mission in New York City. And then ironically, as they go to establish the church, the Swedish Lutheran church in the United States, they become increasingly conservative. So it's a very peculiar reaction that these very liberal ministers actually end up on the other side of the aisle when it comes down to history. Esbjorn in particular emigrated in 1849 with a large contingent because he was very much a leader in the temperance movement, and many times landowners could decide where a priest was, whereas they could be the priest in the local area. And so he was not, and since those landowners oftentimes had interest in distilleries or what was going on, Esbjorn probably left also because there was opportunity here in the United States. Within the organization of the state church in Sweden, he was probably not welcome. So it's ironic that later on he becomes the authority figure the authority figure in trying to suggest that there's a state church. This is Swenson talking about the Methodists. One of the things that is odd from an American point of view, but not from a Swedish point of view, which he's writing from, is that the Lutherans believed that they literally owned all Lutherans who arrived in America. Lutheran in Sweden, you are a Lutheran in the United States. While they had absolutely put much effort into distancing themselves from the state church in Sweden, on the one hand, they were accepting the fact that all those people were naturally Lutheran. And so they complained about proselytizing of the Methodists and then in other communities, the Baptists. And so they have already started this idea that they are the only people who are right and everybody else is doing damage to them. That's a recurring theme. So Bergenlund, as I mentioned, only stayed for 2 years. And why did he go? Well, we don't really know very well, and that part of the book that's missing, it was written about by an article in 1954 by a historian in Sweden. So he had seen the book then, but it was likely a copy that the family still had. And in his synopsis of what happened, there have been many excommunications in that last year. So basically, Bergenlund took and threw half of the church out. My guess is, based on later events, the people he threw out were the more Lutheran-minded people, and that he was much more interested towards the community side of that. Tuve Haskis was sent to look at the situation and try and fix things. Eventually, Bergenlund leaves. He's no longer welcome in our community, and he moves to Andover, which goes on again. And he's first in Moline, then he's in Andover. He's an assistant. For several years, he stays there. He's recognized within the church, and then he's finally not allowed to be ordained, and he becomes a minister in Minnesota. I'm running low on time. I apologize about that. So let me switch on. The second thing that happens is a really tragic event that I want to talk to briefly. In 1858, one of the leaders of the church, his son dies. There's no Lutheran minister here. But by that time, Jonas Swenson had changed the charter of the church in Sugar Grove. The Lutherans took over the church and kicked out any presence of Methodists on the facility. And there was nobody to administer to his son's funeral. He wanted to bring in Redberg, who was an ordained minister, unfortunately working for the other side, for the Methodists at that time. And it created a whole fracture within the community. After Swenson left, and at this time period, there was a great movement of people moving from Sugar Grove to Minnesota. So many families just left. Wasn't over though. Then evidently at the end of Pearson's time, there was friction between two brothers. Now it's clear from the genealogy that those two brothers would have been Frederick and Carl, and there are letters to the minister at the time, Svensson, complaining back and forth about these earlier event, later event. So there, even within the family, there was a breakup of the community. So religion was so important to these early settlers in our area, that it broke up families, broke up the community, and sort of distributed people in deciding to take up and move to an entire different area. So,
Can I just
sorry.
ask a question? Is this news to anybody that lives here? I just, because, I think we've all experienced this.
Oh, yeah.
As I'm listening to you.
Yeah, no,
It hurt
when-
my grandparents
when
talking
you
about
talk
it.
about the way congregations function, this is not unusual.
Right.
I think those, I don't think that it's unusual at
I
all.
think you're telling us something we all sort of knew.
Very good.
Thank
All
you
right,
for coming.
thanks very much for coming.